Welcome back to another explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through today's topic. We are diving into the Gospel of John. Now, this is an ancient, uniquely Jewish text that is just packed with what scholars like to call high theology. But instead of a dry, dense history lesson, we're going to treat this document like a really fascinating case study. We'll be decoding its author, its structural blueprint, and ultimately its core message.
Okay, let's dive into this. Today, we're covering 5 key sections: decoding the author, the blueprint, the method, the wine controversy, and finally, the deity of Christ.
Let's jump right into section 1, decoding the author and the mystery of the unnamed disciple.
So this is a genuine textual mystery, because the author of this gospel never actually gives us his name. Instead, he repeatedly uses this highly specific moniker, the disciple whom Jesus loved. To figure out who this actually is, scholars use a brilliant technique called the elimination procedure. It's kind of like a giant puzzle. First, you list all the disciples who are explicitly named in the book, people like Peter, Thomas, Nathaniel, and even Lazarus. Since the author uses a pen name, he obviously isn't any of these named guys. Second, we exclude early martyrs, like James, who was killed way too early to have written this text. Finally, we look for the glaring omission. Who from Jesus' inner circle is completely missing from the text? The answer is John. He is literally never mentioned by name in this entire gospel, making him the only logical candidate left standing.
But it's not just logical deduction. We actually have hard linguistic evidence too. Take the Greek word metabeno, which means crossed over. Now, in the entire New Testament, this exact word is used in a very rare perfect tense only twice. The first time is in John 5:24. He is crossed over from death to life. And the exact same phrasing with that exact same rare tense pops up again in 1 John 3:14. This is basically a linguistic fingerprint, strongly suggesting that the author of this gospel and the author of the epistles of John are the exact same person, writing with the exact same personal idioms.
Right, so what about the reliability of the physical text itself? The timeline here is just astounding. Jesus' ministry happens around 30 to 33 AD. John writes this document decades later, likely around 95 to 98 AD, over in Ephesus, which is in modern-day Turkey. Now, fast forward a bit to 125 AD. An incredible tiny fragment known as the P52 papyrus was discovered buried deep in the sands of Egypt. Because the super dry Egyptian climate preserved those fragile plant fibers, we have a physical piece of this gospel from within roughly 30 years of its original writing. To put that into perspective, having a manuscript that close to the original author's lifetime is entirely unprecedented in the ancient world.
That brings us to section 2, the blueprint, or the purpose of John. Unlike a lot of ancient writers who kind of leave us guessing about their motives, John tells us his exact reason for writing, flat out. In John 20:30, he states, "These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God." He openly admits he left a ton of other material out, so this entire book is a highly deliberate blueprint. Every single story and detail is carefully curated for one singular purpose: to generate belief in the reader.
But to truly understand this blueprint, we've got to clear up a major translation issue. Take John 3:16, arguably the most famous verse in the whole text. Older translations say God gave his only begotten Son, but the actual Greek word there is monogenes. Mono means one and genes means kind, so it literally translates to one of a kind. Calling Jesus only begotten doesn't actually make a lot of sense historically. For example, Abraham is said to have offered his only begotten son Isaac, right? But actually, scratch that. We know Abraham also had Ishmael and other sons. So Isaac was his one-of-a-kind son, just as John is portraying Jesus as God's one-of-a-kind son.
So, how exactly does John execute this blueprint? Let's look at section 3, the method, focusing on signs, miracles, and belief.
And this brilliantly illustrates the difference between John and the other Gospels. In texts like Matthew or Mark, the formula goes something like this: a person exhibits belief, and then the miracle happens. John flips this narrative mechanic entirely on its head. In this book, Jesus performs a miracle first, and the resulting awe is what generates belief in the audience.
To do this, John selectively hones in on 7 profound sign miracles. They include turning water into an astonishing 160 gallons of wine at Cana, putting mud on a blind man's eyes and sending him to wash in the pool of Siloam, and famously raising Lazarus from the dead after 4 days. And John's historical accuracy here is just phenomenal. For instance, he mentions a paralyzed man at the pool of Bethesda, specifically noting that the pool had exactly 5 covered colonnades, For a long time, skeptics doubted this detail, but guess what? Archaeologists have literally unearthed those exact 5 colonnades in Jerusalem.
Now, that very first miracle, turning water into 160 gallons of wine at a wedding, naturally sparks a pretty massive cultural question. What does this ancient text actually say about alcohol?
Let's look at Section 4, the cultural context and the wine controversy. We'll impartially examine the biblical facts alongside our lecturer's personal stance on the issue.
Functionally speaking, the biblical text shows wine being used in some really highly practical ways. Remember, without modern water purification, the ancient world had terrible bacteria in their drinking water. The Apostle Paul actually tells Timothy to drink a little wine for his stomach just to kill this bacteria. It was also used as a heavy painkiller for severe trauma to prevent the body from going into shock, kind of like something you'd see in an old John Wayne movie. Plus, it was deeply embedded in religious communion. The juice from crushed grapes would naturally ferment into new wine within a matter of days because they completely lacked refrigeration, making it an absolute staple of the Passover meal.
However, the text forcefully balances this utility with some severe warnings against the destructive nature of drunkenness. Proverbs 23 warns that while wine might look really appealing in the cup, in the end it bites like a snake, it poisons like a viper. The text repeatedly lists drunkenness as a serious vice, specifically warning that it absolutely destroys a person's moral judgment and causes leaders to completely forget what the law decrees.
Because of these strong warnings, and honestly the tragic consequences of alcoholism in our modern society, the lecturer of our source material, Dr. Hildebrandt, shares that he practices what he calls soft abstinence. After tragically losing a promising young student named Eric to a drunk driver, he made the personal choice to remove alcohol from his life. But he makes sure to note that this is a personal liberty stance, not a strict biblical mandate. He still completely respects cultural norms. For instance, he'll partake in a glass of wine when he's hosted by locals over in Jerusalem, just so as not to cause offense.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we pivot from that cultural history right back to the ultimate question of the text. When the water becomes wine, or when the blind man suddenly sees, what is John actually trying to prove about the core identity of Jesus?
And that brings us to our final section, the core thesis, the deity of Christ.
Way back in the ancient church, critics, like a man named Cerinthus, claimed that Jesus was just a regular, everyday human being upon whom the Spirit of God temporarily descended. Well, John's Gospel completely refutes this. It pushes a very high theology, claiming Jesus is not just a prophet, but God himself in the flesh. And this claim is so bold that it actually remains a major theological dispute even today. In the very first verse, John 1:1, standard Greek translations across different denominations read, "And the Word was God." However, the Jehovah's Witnesses' New World Translation alters this to read, "And the Word was a God," using a lowercase g. Our source material notes that Greek scholars across the board firmly agree that the standard translation, "the Word was God," is the accurate reading of the original text.
And John doesn't just say this once. He builds a relentless case. In John 8:58, Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am." Now that is taking the exact sacred name of God straight from the Old Testament burning bush. And the original audience, they understood this perfectly. They literally picked up stones to execute him right then and there for blasphemy. Later in John 10, he states, "I and the Father are one," which directly challenged the absolute core Jewish tenet of monotheism. Finally, after the resurrection, a doubting Thomas touches Jesus' physical wounds and declares, "My Lord and my God."
So what does this all mean? Well, it brings us to the ultimate challenge of John's blueprint. The author weaves this incredibly rich tapestry of history, vivid miracles, and incredibly bold claims to essentially force the reader into making a decision. If John is a reliable eyewitness and his account has incredibly survived 2 millennia to reach us today, the text leaves us with one provocative concluding question. What does it mean for you to believe that Jesus Christ is God? I really hope this explainer sparked your curiosity today, and I highly encourage you to keep exploring the incredible history behind this text.